The wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from the land and leaving a chill that went straight to the bone. It howled across the high plains, bending the prairie grass until it lay flat, a rippling sea of amber and pale green under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Clouds, heavy and dark with unshed rain, gathered on the western horizon, promising a storm that would be more violence than relief. Calder Reese felt the coming squall in the dull ache of his ribs, a reminder of a fight he had finished 2 days prior. He rode easy in the saddle, his body a familiar extension of the powerful gray stallion beneath him. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was a roadmap of a hard 35 years. A thick, dark mustache covered his upper lip, but it could not hide the grim set of his mouth or the hollowness in his gray eyes, the look of a man who had seen too much and felt too little for too long. He had just returned from the South Fork of the river, where a man with more money than sense had tried to run a family of sodbusters off their claim. Calder had delivered a different kind of justice, one that did not require a judge or a jury. Only a firm hand and the conviction that some lines were not meant to be crossed. His knuckles were raw, but his soul felt no lighter for it. Justice was a bitter meal that never filled the emptiness inside him. His ranch was a solitary outpost against the vast, unforgiving landscape. A small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. A barn that leaned slightly to the north as if braced against the constant wind, and a set of corrals. It was a lonely place, and he had made it that way on purpose. Loneliness was a wall, and walls kept things out. More importantly, they kept things in. As he drew near, his horse, Jericho, pricked his ears and let out a low, uneasy nicker. The stallion's senses were sharper than any man's. Calder's hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, his eyes scanning the property. Nothing seemed out of place. The chickens were scratching in the dirt near the cabin, and the door was shut tight as he had left it. But Jericho tossed his head again, his gaze fixed on the barn. Calder dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The air was thick with the smell of dust and ozone. He gave Jericho's neck a reassuring pat. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that was lost to the wind. He drew the heavy pistol, its weight familiar and cold in his palm, and moved toward the barn with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man who knew how to walk through the world without being noticed. The large barn door was closed, but not barred. He pushed it open a few inches, enough to slip inside. The interior was dim, filled with the familiar smells of hay, leather, and horse. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that cut through the cracks in the walls. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a small sound, a choked-off sob from the far corner, behind a stack of old feed sacks. He did not call out. He just stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. He saw her then, a small shape huddled against the rough-hewn planks, trying to make herself invisible. She was a girl, maybe 18 or 19, with a tangle of dark hair plastered to her face by rain and tears. Her dress, a simple calico, was ripped at the shoulder and soaked through, clinging to a frame that was far too thin. Her feet were bare, caked in mud and scratched raw. A dark bruise was blooming on her cheekbone, stark against the pallor of her skin. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wide with the terror of a cornered animal. They were the color of a summer sky just before dawn, a pale, fragile blue. But right now they were dark with fear. She flinched as if expecting a blow, her whole body tensing. Calder lowered the barrel of his gun toward the floor. Though he did not holster it, he kept his voice even, stripped of any emotion that might spook her further. "This is private property," he said, the words sounding harsh in the charged silence. She said nothing, only pulled her knees tighter to her chest. A tremor ran through her, a violent shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Her lips parted, but only a ragged breath came out. She shook her head, a small, frantic gesture. Then she found her voice, a whisper so faint it was nearly swallowed by the rising wind outside. "I ran," she said. That was all. I ran. It was not an explanation, but a confession. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between them. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the raw fear in every line of her body. He had seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of a deer just before the wolf closes in. He holstered the Colt. The sound of the leather snapping shut made her jump. "There's a storm coming," he said, his tone flat and practical. "You can stay in here. Do not light the lantern." He turned and left, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the deepening shadows. He went to the cabin, stoked the fire in the hearth, and cut a thick slice of bread from a loaf on the table. He filled a tin cup with water from the pump outside. He took the meager offerings back to the barn and set them on the dirt floor just inside the door without a word. He did not look at her again. He felt her eyes on his back as he walked away, a weight he did not want but could not shrug off. For 3 days, she was a ghost on his land. He kept his distance, a silent agreement passing between them. He would leave food and water by the barn door twice a day, and when he returned, the plate and cup would be empty. He never saw her eat. He only caught glimpses of her, a flicker of movement in the shadows of the barn, a small face peering through a crack in the wall before vanishing. He tried not to think about her, but it was impossible. Her presence was a stone dropped into the still, dark waters of his solitude. On the first night, he had taken an old woolen blanket out to the barn and laid it over a pile of clean straw, thinking it would be better than the cold ground. The next morning, he found the blanket folded neatly, but she was asleep on the hard-packed earth a few feet away, curled into a tight ball as if trying to protect herself even in her dreams. It was a kind of penance, he realized. She was punishing herself. He saw the way she moved, always staying close to the walls, never crossing an open space. She never met his gaze, always looking at the ground, at his boots, at anything but his face. When he once came around the corner of the barn too quickly, she gasped and stumbled backward, her hands flying up to shield her head. He had stopped dead in his tracks, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He had simply turned and walked away, giving her the space she so desperately craved. The bruises on her body were fading, but the ones inside were deep and raw. He knew what that felt like. On the 4th day, his supply of flour ran low. He saddled Jericho and rode the 10 miles to Red Creek, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings that barely earned the right to be called a town. He hated going to town. The noise, the people, the prying eyes, it all grated on his nerves. He preferred the silence of the prairie, a silence that was empty but at least honest. He tied Jericho to the hitching post outside the general store and went inside. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. Silas Croft, the proprietor, gave him a curt nod from behind the counter. "Reese," Croft said. "Need my flour, coffee, and salt." "Figured," Croft replied, beginning to measure out the goods. 2 ranchers were leaning against the counter, talking in low voices. Calder paid them no mind until a name caught his ear. Tobias Quinn. "Heard Quinn put a $50 bounty on her," one of the ranchers said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. $50 for a runaway girl. Seems steep." The other man grunted. "Not just any girl. Quinn was fit to be tied. Paid a pretty penny to bring those girls all the way from St. Louis. Said she was the prize of the lot." Calder kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a display of new axes. His hands stilled. What he was doing was not right. Croft muttered from behind the counter, his voice thick with disapproval. Parading those poor girls around like livestock. Calling it a bride auction? Shameful business. A bride auction. The words hung in the air, ugly and obscene. Calder's blood ran cold. He pictured the girl in his barn, her bare, scratched feet, the terror in her eyes. "Still," the first rancher continued, Quinn claimed he had contracts, said they were his property. That little one just vanished into thin air the night of the storm. Quinn and his men tore the town apart looking for her before they moved on. Calder paid for his supplies, his movements stiff. He did not say a word, just loaded the sacks onto his horse and swung into the saddle. The ride back to the ranch was long, the prairie stretching out before him like a canvas of his own emptiness. The rancher's words echoed in his head. Property, prize of the lot. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to burn through him. An anger he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. It was a dangerous feeling. Anger led to action, and action led to attachment. He wanted none of it, but it was too late. The girl in his barn was no longer just a stranger. She had a story, a brutal one, and he was now a part of it. That night, the memories came for him, as they always did when his guard was down. He sat by the fire in his small cabin, the wind rattling the window pane, and let the past wash over him. 5 years ago, this cabin had not been so quiet then. It had been filled with the light of his wife's smile and the sound of his son's laughter. Sarah, her hair had been the color of sun-cured hay, and her hands, though chapped from work, had always been gentle. And Thomas, their boy, he had just turned 6, all tangled limbs and endless questions, with his mother's bright eyes and his father's stubborn chin. They had been a world unto themselves, there on that lonely patch of land. He had been building a life. Not just a ranch, a future. Then the raiders came. They were not looking for money or horses. They were just men filled with a mean, pointless kind of hate, sweeping across the territory like a plague. He had been out mending a fence line miles from the cabin when he saw the smoke. He rode Jericho so hard the horse was bleeding from the lungs by the time they reached the crest of the hill overlooking their home. The sight that met him broke him in two. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, and in the yard, the memory was a sharp, physical pain, a blade twisting in his gut. Sarah, lying near the porch where she had been trying to run. Thomas, small and still, by the water pump. He remembered falling from his horse, the world turning into a silent, gray blur. He remembered digging their graves with his bare hands until they were bloody stumps. He buried them under the lone cottonwood tree by the creek, the only beautiful thing for miles. After that, the man he had been died. In his place was someone colder, harder, a shell. He rebuilt the cabin, but he could not rebuild the life. The silence his family left behind was a living thing, a constant companion. He had tried to outrun it, working himself to exhaustion day after day, but it was always there when he closed his eyes, defending others, like the sodbuster family, was the only thing that made him feel anything close to human. It was a way of fighting back against the kind of senseless cruelty that had stolen his world. It was his penance for not being there, for surviving. He looked into the flames, his face a mask of stone. He understood the girl in his barn. He understood the need to hide, to be silent, to sleep on the hard floor because you felt you deserved nothing more than pain. The next afternoon, another storm rolled in, this one angrier than the last. Thunder cracked overhead, and rain lashed against the barn in sheets. Calder was in the stalls, checking on Jericho, who was skittish from the noise. He ran a brush over the stallion's powerful flank, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. "Just the sky making a fuss. Boy," he murmured. The words meant more for himself than the horse. "It will pass. Always does." He spoke of the weather, of the need to check the south fence come morning. Simple things. It was a voice he had not used with another living soul in 5 years. The gentle, unguarded tone he had reserved for Sarah and Thomas. He did not know she was there, standing just inside the barn door, until a small sound made him turn. She was watching him, her arms wrapped around herself. The raw fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by something else. A quiet watchfulness, a flicker of curiosity. For the first time, she did not look away when he met her gaze. The storm raged outside, But inside the barn, the world seemed to hold its breath. She took a hesitant step forward. "My name," she said, her voice still a whisper, but clear and steady. "It's Evelyn." He simply nodded, accepting the name as the gift it was. He went back to brushing his horse, giving her a moment. She took another step. "That man in town, the one they're talking about," he put out a notice. "For my return," she said the last words as if they were poison on her tongue. "There is a bounty." She finally asked the question that had been haunting her for days, the question that had kept her sleeping on the floor and flinching at every sound. Are you going to turn me in?" Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, forcing herself to face the answer. Calder stopped brushing. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. The haunted look in his eyes was still there, but for the first time, she saw a flicker of something deeper, a shared understanding of pain. He thought of the $50. It was a lot of money, enough to buy a new bull, to fix the roof before winter. It meant nothing. He looked at this fragile, broken girl who had been treated like property, who expected nothing from the world but more cruelty. He gave her the only thing he had left to give another person, a choice. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a solemn oath. "Not unless you want me to." His words hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of her fear. "Not unless you want me to." Evelyn did not reply, only gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before retreating back into the shadows of the barn, as if the light in the conversation had been too much to bear. Calder let her go. He understood that trust was not a door that could be kicked open. It had to be unlocked from the inside, and she was the only one who held the key. That night, the sky broke open. The storm that had been threatening for days arrived with a primal fury. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof of the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. Wind screamed through the eaves, a mournful, relentless sound that vibrated deep in the chest. Each crack of thunder was a cannon shot that seemed to split the very foundations of the earth, followed by flashes of lightning that bleached the world white for a terrifying, jagged heartbeat. Calder sat at his small table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern. He was accustomed to the violence of prairie storms, but this one felt different. It felt personal. He found his thoughts drifting to the barn, to the girl huddled alone in the dark. He imagined the thunder sounding like angry shouts, the lightning like the flash of a striking hand. He set his tools down, the unease in his gut too strong to ignore. He pulled on his slicker, grabbed the lantern, and leaned into the wind, fighting his way across the muddy yard. The barn door groaned in protest as he forced it open. The lantern light cut a weak, golden swath through the oppressive darkness. He found her in the farthest stall, pressed into the corner so tightly she seemed to be trying to merge with the wood. She was not just shivering, she was trembling, her whole body convulsed by a terror so profound it was almost silent. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on a past he could not imagine, and with every clap of thunder, a low, guttural whimper escaped her lips. The straw bed and blanket he had provided lay untouched. He knew then that leaving her here was an act of cruelty. The barn was no longer a shelter. It was a cage filled with her ghosts. He approached slowly, keeping the lantern low. "Evelyn," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. She did not seem to hear him. He knelt a few feet away. "Evelyn," he repeated, a little louder. "You cannot stay out here." Her head snapped toward him, her eyes finally focusing. For a moment, he saw a wild, cornered panic, and he thought she might bolt. But then something shifted, a flicker of recognition, a grasping at the anchor of his presence in the terrifying sea of her memory. "Come inside," he said. It was not a request. He stood and held out a hand. She stared at his hand as if it were a coiled snake. It was calloused and scarred. A man's hand, a hand that could do harm, but he held it steady, palm up. An offering. After a long, agonizing moment, she uncurled herself from the corner and rose on shaky legs. She did not take his hand, but she followed him. He led her through the deluge and into the warmth of the cabin. The moment she was inside, she scurried to the farthest corner of the room, near the cold stone of the hearth, and slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She was a small, sodden bundle of misery. Calder hung his wet slicker by the door and added another log to the fire. The flames leaped up, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He did not press her. He did not offer her the bed or a chair. He simply moved to the other side of the hearth and sat on the floor himself, leaning his back against the wall. He gave her the one thing he suspected she had never been given, the choice to be left alone, even when she was not. For hours, they sat in a shared silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the muffled rage of the storm outside. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw the tension slowly seep out of her shoulders, the violent tremors subsiding into a faint shiver. Her breathing deepened, evening out. The warmth of the fire was a comforting hand on her back. Sometime after midnight, her head drooped and her eyes fluttered shut. She slumped sideways, her cheek resting on the rough spun rug before the fireplace. And finally, she slept. Calder stayed awake for a long time after, a silent, solitary guardian in the quiet house. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. When Calder stirred from his own light doze, he found Evelyn awake. She was still by the fire, but she had retrieved the blanket he had left in the barn and was wrapped in it, watching the flames with an intense, unreadable expression. There was a plate and cup on the floor beside her, empty. From that day forward, a new, unspoken routine began to form. She did not return to the barn. She slept on the rug by the hearth, and he did not question it. She began to emerge from her shell, not with words, but with actions. One morning, he came outside to find she had already scattered feed for the chickens. She moved with a nervous, bird-like quickness, but she did it thoroughly. The next day, he found her in the barn, not hiding, but gently brushing Jericho's coat. The big stallion, who was often cantankerous with strangers, stood perfectly still for her, his head lowered as she worked the brush through his mane with a quiet, focused grace. Slowly, carefully, she began to claim small spaces for herself in his world. She started tending to the small vegetable patch Sarah had planted years ago, which he had let go to weeds. Her hands, though unused to the work, were deft and gentle. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, and watered the thirsty plants with a reverence that was almost prayerful. He would watch her from the porch, noticing things. She was smart. When the handle of the well pump came loose, she studied it for a long time before finding 2 flat stones to use as a makeshift wrench, tightening the bolt herself. She was careful, never leaving a tool out of place, always closing a gate behind her. Her movements were economical and precise, the habits of someone who had learned to survive by being unobtrusive and efficient. But he also saw the deep, abiding sadness that clung to her like a shroud. She was emotionally shut down, a fortress of silence. There were no smiles, no idle chatter. Her face was a placid mask that betrayed nothing, but her eyes were old, filled with a weariness that did not belong in someone so young. She seemed to be perpetually waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness he showed her to reveal itself as a trick, a prelude to a demand. She was waiting for punishment, for rejection, for the betrayal that her life had clearly taught her was inevitable. One afternoon, they were both in the barn, he mending a piece of tack and she cleaning out the stalls. The comfortable silence had become their primary mode of communication. But today, he felt a need to break it. He wanted to understand the person, not just the survivor. "You are good with the horses," he said, his voice quiet. She stopped her work, but did not look at him. "They do not ask for anything you cannot give." The simple truth of her words settled heavily in the air. He stitched for a moment longer before speaking again, his tone gentle. "Evelyn, what happened to you before you came here?" She froze, her back ramrod straight. He thought she would ignore him, that he had crossed a line and sent her retreating back into her fortress. When she finally turned, her face was pale, her expression distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the barn. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, a simple statement of a terrible fact. "They wanted my body," she said, "not my voice." She turned back to her work, and the conversation was over. But the words remained, echoing in the silence. They were the most honest and brutal thing he had ever heard. They spoke of a profound dehumanization, of being reduced to an object, a vessel for the desires of others. He looked at his own hands, at the scars and calluses, and felt a familiar, helpless rage swell within him. He wanted to find the men who had stolen her voice and tear them apart, but he knew, with a certainty that was as bitter as gall, that violence would not give it back to her. A week later, trouble rode into his yard. He was splitting firewood when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of riders approaching. It was 3 men. He recognized one immediately. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was as flexible as his morals. The other 2 were strangers, hard-faced men with guns tied low on their hips. They were not deputies. They were hired muscle. Calder did not stop his work. He planted his feet, swung the axe, and split a log with a clean, sharp crack. He saw Evelyn, who had been hanging laundry on a line. "Freeze!" She gathered the damp sheets into her arms and scurried into the cabin like a frightened rabbit. The riders pulled up, their horses dancing nervously. Sheriff Miller stayed in the saddle, affecting an air of authority that did not suit him. "Reese," the sheriff said, his voice hearty and false. "Good to see you." Calder leaned the axe against the chopping block and wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He did not return the greeting. He just waited, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I am out here on official business," Miller said, gesturing vaguely to the men beside him. "Got a report about some stolen property. A girl ran off from the Quinn encampment a couple of weeks back. Thought she might have wandered out this way." Calder's gaze shifted to the 2 thugs. They stared back at him, their expressions flat and predatory. He looked back at the sheriff. "I have not seen any property," he said, his voice even. Miller's practiced smile faltered. "Now, see here, Reese. We have reason to believe she is on your land. A young woman, dark hair, blue eyes, answers to the name Evelyn. There is no one here who does not want to be here." Calder said. It was not a denial. It was a statement of principle. One of the thugs shifted in his saddle. "We have a warrant from Mr. Quinn for the return of his merchandise. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." Calder slowly straightened up, his full height seeming to cast a shadow over the men. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his gun. He did not have to. The quiet menace that radiated from him was more potent than any overt threat. "This is my land," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "The only warrant that matters out here is mine. You have got 3 minutes to be on the other side of that ridge." The sheriff's face paled. He knew Calder's reputation. He knew Calder was not a man who made idle threats. He looked at his hired guns, who suddenly seemed less confident under Calder's unwavering stare. Miller cleared his throat. "No need for trouble. Reese," he stammered, pulling on his reins. "Just doing my job." He turned his horse and kicked it into a trot, the 2 thugs falling in behind him. They did not look back. Calder watched them until they were nothing more than a speck of dust in the distance. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the prairie settling around him once more. But it was a different kind of silence now, one that was charged with the threat of what was to come. When he finally went inside, he found the cabin in disarray. The laundry basket was overturned. The sheets spilled across the floor. A chair was knocked over, and Evelyn was huddled in the corner again, just as she had been during the storm. But this time, she was not silent. She was weeping, her body racked with deep, agonizing sobs of despair. "I am sorry," she choked out, the words torn from her. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to bring this on you. I cannot bring shame. I cannot bring trouble. Not to you, not to someone so kind." She was trying to fold in on herself, to disappear. He saw in her a crushing, soul-deep guilt, the belief that she was a contagion, a blight on anyone who showed her decency. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her. He did not know what to say. Words were useless against this kind of pain, so he did the only thing he could. He reached out and gently pulled her into his arms, holding her as she wept. She was stiff at first, her body rigid with shock and fear, but he just held her, one hand on her back, the other cradling her head, offering a silent, solid strength. Slowly, tentatively, the rigidity eased. She sagged against him, her tears soaking the front of his shirt, her small hands clutching his arms as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear her apart. He said nothing. He just held her, absorbing her grief, letting her finally break in a place where she felt safe enough to do so. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken emotions. The confrontation had shattered the fragile peace of their routine, but it had also forged something new in its place, a bond. They ate their simple meal of beans and bread in silence. The space between them no longer empty, but filled with a heavy, pulsing awareness. Later, as they sat before the fire, the tension was almost unbearable. It was not the tension of fear, but of profound, terrifying vulnerability. The walls they had both so carefully constructed around themselves had been breached. Evelyn sat on her rug, staring into the flames, her hands twisting a loose thread on her blanket. Her face was etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a new, fragile kind of hope. She finally looked at him, her pale blue eyes luminous in the firelight. Her voice was barely a whisper, a breath of sound in the quiet room. "Will it hurt?" The question caught him off guard. He thought for a moment she was talking about the men, about what might happen. But as he looked into her eyes, he understood. She was not asking about a fight. She was asking about him, about this fragile, terrifying thing growing between them. She was asking if trusting him, if letting down her guard and allowing herself to feel safe, would only lead to more pain in the end. It was the most vulnerable question she could possibly ask. He felt the old, familiar grief rise in his throat, the memory of Sarah and Thomas, the agonizing pain of loss. He knew what it was to be hurt. He knew that loving someone, trusting someone, was the most dangerous thing a person could do in this world, but he also knew it was the only thing that mattered. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness, but also with an unwavering sincerity. He gave her the only honest answer he could, a promise that put all the power, all the control, in her hands. He smiled, a sad, gentle curve of his lips. "Only if you don't want it to." Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a glistening path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She simply gave him a small, trembling nod of understanding. That night, they sat in silence before the fire, the emotional tension heavy but unspoken. He had not offered her a cure for her pain or a solution to her problems. He had offered her something far more valuable. He had offered her a choice. And in that choice, a seed of hope, fragile and tentative, began to take root in the barren soil of their broken lives. The brutal heat of summer finally broke, surrendering to the crisp, golden days of early autumn. The prairie grass faded from green to a pale, shimmering gold, and the sky took on a deeper, more piercing shade of blue. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the cottonwood tree by the creek began to shed its leaves. Laying a yellow carpet over the graves of a woman and a boy Calder no longer allowed himself to name. The change of season seemed to mirror a change within the small, silent world of the ranch. The raw fear that had defined Evelyn's existence was slowly, cautiously, being replaced by a fragile kind of peace. Her story came out in pieces, offered up like small, precious stones she had carried for too long. It was never a formal telling, but fragments that emerged in the quiet moments between chores. One evening, as she was helping him shell beans on the porch while the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, she spoke of her mother. She liked to play cards, Evelyn said, her voice so low it was almost part of the evening breeze. Her hands never stopped their rhythmic work, splitting the pods and pushing the beans into a clay bowl. She was not very good at it. A man came to our house one day. He said she owed him a great deal of money. She told him she had nothing left to give. Evelyn's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. She was wrong. Calder did not reply. He just kept shelling beans, the steady sound a comfort in the heavy silence. He did not offer words of pity or outrage. He simply listened, and in his quiet, unwavering presence, she found the space to continue. Another time, while they were repairing the roof of the chicken coop, she talked about the place Quinn had taken her. It was not a house, she said, handing him a nail. It was a collection of rooms. Mine had a lock on the outside of the door. There was a woman who would come in every day. She taught me how to walk, how to sit, how to pour tea, how to smile, even when you did not want to. She looked down at her hands, which were smudged with dirt and pine tar. She taught me all the things a man might find desirable, but she never taught me how to say no. That was not part of the lesson. He took the nail from her, their fingers brushing for a moment. Her skin was cool. He hammered the nail in with 3 sharp, precise blows, the violence of the act a stark contrast to the gentleness he felt stirring inside him. He was building a wall of anger around the thought of that locked room, a fortress of rage he would have to keep to himself. To counter the lessons of her past, he began to teach her new ones. He started with Jericho. He showed her how to saddle the big stallion, how to hold the reins, how to communicate with the pressure of her knees. At first, she was terrified, her body stiff and awkward atop the powerful animal. "He can feel that you are scared," Calder told her, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "Just breathe. Let him carry you. You are in charge, not him." Day after day, he led her around the corral in slow circles. He watched as her fear gave way to a tentative confidence. She learned the rhythm of the horse's gait, the way he responded to the slightest command. One afternoon, he let go of the lead rope. Evelyn gasped, her hands tightening on the reins. But she did not panic. She straightened her back, looked ahead, and urged Jericho into a slow walk on her own. A look of profound, breathtaking astonishment crossed her face. For the first time, she was in control of her own direction, her own movement. She was not being led or carried. She was riding. It was the beginning of freedom. Next, he taught her how to shoot. He started her with an old Winchester rifle, heavy and solid in her small hands. The first time she fired it, the recoil knocked her back a step, and the explosion made her flinch. Her eyes squeezed shut, but she did not drop it. "Again," was all he said. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe out as she squeezed the trigger. He taught her to respect the weapon not as a tool of violence, but as a tool of self-reliance. It was a way of saying, "No one will hurt you again, not while you have the power to stop them." She became a surprisingly good shot, her focus intense, her hand steady. Each time she hit the tin can he set up on a fence post, a small, tight knot of tension seemed to dissolve inside her. He taught her how to mend fences, showing her how to stretch the wire taut and hammer in the staples. He taught her how to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks. These were the lessons of his world, the skills of survival, and he gave them to her as if they were the most valuable inheritance he could pass on. He was giving her back a piece of the world they had tried to take from her. And then, one afternoon, it happened. She was feeding the chickens, scattering the grain in wide arcs. A small chick, bolder than the rest, began pecking at the laces of her boot. She looked down, and a smile touched her lips. It was not the trained, empty smile from the locked room. It was a small, quiet, utterly genuine curve of her mouth, and it lit up her whole face, chasing the shadows from her eyes for a brilliant, fleeting moment. Calder saw it from the porch where he was mending a bridle. The sight hit him like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. An unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he did not recognize it at first. It was hope, and it terrified him. The moment he felt it, the cold hand of his past clamped down on his heart. Hope was a precursor to pain. Love was a preface to loss. He had learned that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. He stood up abruptly and went inside, the broken bridle forgotten in his hands. He could not look at her. He could not let that feeling take root. He was a barren field, and nothing good could be allowed to grow there again. For the next 2 days, he was distant, his voice clipped, his answers short. He buried himself in the hardest physical labor he could find, avoiding her presence, avoiding her eyes. He was pulling back, retreating behind the walls he had built 5 years ago. He saw the confusion in her face, the way the light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by the old, familiar wariness. He was hurting her. He knew, but he was more afraid of what would happen if he did not. His retreat was cut short by the arrival of a buckboard wagon rattling up the path to the cabin. It was Martha Gable, the wife of Red Creek's preacher, a woman whose piety was matched only by her insatiable curiosity. She was a purveyor of both scripture and gossip, and Calder's stomach tightened the moment he saw her. "Calder," she called out, her voice unnaturally bright. "I was just on my way back from the Miller homestead and thought I would drop off this jar of spiced peaches, a little Christian charity for our town's most solitary soul." She was already climbing down from the wagon as Evelyn came around the side of the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from an old flour sack. For a moment, time stood still. Mrs. Gable's smile froze on her face. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered over Evelyn, taking in the simple dress, the bare feet, the still faint bruise on her cheek. Recognition dawned, followed by a look of profound, scandalized disapproval. "Well, Mrs." Gable said, her voice turning as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "I see you are not so solitary after all." She thrust the jar of peaches into Calder's hands. "I must be going. The preacher will be expecting me for supper." She turned without another word, climbed back into her wagon, and snapped the reins, leaving them standing in a cloud of dust and suffocating silence. They both knew what was coming. A secret could not survive Martha Gable's notice for more than a day. The whispers started within 48 hours. They rode on the wind from town, carried by ranchers passing on the trail, by the averted eyes of Silas Croft at the general store. Fallen woman, soiled dove, Quinn's property. The words were ugly, branding Evelyn with a shame that was not hers to carry. They branded him, too, for harboring her, for defying the town's unspoken moral code. The whispers finally took physical form a week later. It was dusk when they arrived. A grim procession of 12 men and 4 women, their faces set in masks of self-righteousness. Preacher Gable was at their head, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. Calder had seen them coming from a mile off. He met them on his porch, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Evelyn was inside. The door shut firmly behind him. "Calder," the preacher began, his voice booming with false authority. "We have come as concerned members of this community. It has come to our attention that you are sheltering a woman of ill repute, a source of sin and temptation." "This is my property, preacher," Calder said, his voice dangerously calm. "The only sin I see here is trespass." We are asking you, as a God-fearing man, to turn her out." One of the women chimed in, her face pinched with disdain. "For the sake of decency, we cannot have her kind living among us." Her kind. The words ignited the cold anger that simmered just beneath Calder's surface. He looked at their faces, at their smug certainty, and their petty, cruel judgments. They knew nothing of Evelyn's strength, of her quiet resilience, of the battles she fought every single day just to exist. "You are on my land," Calder said, his voice dropping. "I will not ask you again. Leave." He took a step forward, and the rifle no longer looked casual. The mob hesitated, their conviction wavering in the face of his cold, implacable resolve. They muttered amongst themselves, their moral courage failing them, and began to disperse, casting hateful glances at the cabin door. But it was not over. The confrontation forced Sheriff Miller's hand. The next day, he rode out to the ranch, alone this time. "Calder, you have stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, looking tired and unhappy. "The town council is demanding a meeting. You have to come and speak. You have to explain yourself. If you do not, they will form a committee to have her removed." So he went. He and Evelyn rode into Red Creek together, her head held high, though he could feel the tremors running through her. The town hall was packed. It felt less like a meeting and more like a trial. Every eye was on them, 100 tiny judgments piercing their skin. Preacher Gable spoke first, his voice ringing with condemnation. He spoke of sin and damnation, of moral decay and the sanctity of their community. He painted Evelyn as a temptress, a Jezebel, and Calder as a man led astray. He never once mentioned her name. She was simply the fallen woman. When he finished, a smug silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Calder. He walked to the front, standing not before the council, but turning to face the whole assembly. He let the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting every eye. "I have heard the preacher talk about sin," Calder began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "He seems to know a lot about it, but he does not seem to know much about courage, or strength, or what it means to survive something that would have broken every single one of you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You call her a fallen woman. You whisper about shame. You look at her and see a sinner. I look at her, and I see a girl who was sold like a piece of a livestock. I see a girl who was locked in a room and taught that her only worth was her body. I see a girl who found the courage to run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a will to live that you sanctimonious, comfortable people could never possibly understand." His voice grew stronger, laced with a contempt so profound it was like a physical force. "She has faced more evil in her short life than you will ever see in your long ones. She's braver than any of you." He looked directly at the preacher's wife, then at the other women who had come to his ranch. "And if you want to call that shame, then you'd best look in a mirror first." He turned and walked back to Evelyn, taking her hand. A wave of murmuring swept through the crowd. He had not offered a defense. He had delivered an indictment. He had held up a mirror, and they did not like the reflection. People began to look away, to shuffle their feet. The righteous anger of the crowd dissolved into a quiet, collective shame. They filed out of the hall, avoiding his gaze. As they left, one man remained, standing near the back. He had not been part of the mob, but he had watched the proceedings with a cold, calculating intensity. He was well dressed, with a clean-shaven face and eyes as dead as a snake's. Calder did not recognize him, but he felt the man's hatred like a physical chill. The man turned to a rancher standing beside him. "Who is he?" the rancher asked, nodding toward Calder. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "That," he said, his voice low and full of venom, "is the man who is going to pay for stealing my brother's property. My name is Tobias Quinn, and I promise you, he will pay for everything." The verdict he had delivered at the town hall bought them a fragile, temporary peace, but it was the peace of the deep breath before the plunge. Tobias Quinn's parting threat had not been idle, and a new kind of silence settled over the ranch. It was not the comfortable silence of two solitary people learning to share a space, but a brittle, watchful quiet, heavy with the anticipation of violence. Calder felt it in the unnatural stillness of the air, in the way the wind seemed to whisper a warning through the tall grass. He began to prepare. He spent an afternoon cleaning and oiling every firearm he owned. The Colt, the Winchester, and a heavy-bladed Bowie knife he had not touched in years. He checked the hinges on the cabin door and reinforced the latch on the window. He walked the perimeter of his land each morning and evening, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for the telltale plume of dust that would signal riders. He was a man bracing for a siege, his movements economical and grim, his face a mask of cold resolve. Evelyn watched him, and a profound, suffocating guilt began to eat away at the small patch of hope that had started to grow inside her. She saw the exhaustion that was beginning to line his eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his hip. She had run from a cage only to bring its bars with her, encircling this man who had shown her nothing but decency. He had stood before an entire town and defended her, absorbing their hatred and scorn onto himself. Now, he was preparing to defend her with his life. She was a storm he had pulled inside his own walls, and she knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in her gut, that the storm would eventually tear his world apart, just as it had torn apart her own. The kindness he had shown her was a debt she could never repay, but she could stop it from growing. She could prevent the final, terrible price from being collected. The thought took root in the dark soil of her guilt and grew into a painful, necessary resolve. She would leave. She would disappear back into the vast, indifferent wilderness, and in doing so, she would take the danger with her. It was the only gift she had to give him, the gift of her absence. She waited 3 days, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She performed her chores with a meticulous, desperate focus, memorizing the feel of the worn handle of the water pump, the smell of the hay in the barn, the sound of Calder's steady breathing from across the cabin as he slept. These were small treasures, moments of peace she had never thought she would know, and she hoarded them like a miser. On the 3rd night, she waited until the moon was high and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Calder was asleep in his bed, a dark shape under a single blanket. He looked exhausted even in rest. Quietly, her movements as silent as a falling shadow, she slipped out of the cabin. She had already saddled Jericho, leaving the stallion tied loosely in his stall. She did not dare take him. The horse was a part of Calder, and she would not be a thief. She would walk until she could walk no more. She returned to the cabin for one last thing. By the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she found a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of wrapping paper she had saved from a trip to the general store. Her hand trembled as she wrote, the words simple and stark. "You gave me a choice. This is mine. I will not be the reason your home burns. Thank you." She left the note on the table where he would be sure to find it. She allowed herself one last look at his sleeping form, a painful lump forming in her throat. Then she turned and slipped out the door, closing it gently behind her, shutting herself out of the only safe place she had ever known. She had not made it 100 yards from the cabin when a floorboard inside creaked. Calder was a light sleeper, his senses honed by years of solitude and a lifetime of vigilance. A moment later, the cabin door opened. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure of profound stillness. He did not call out her name. He did not have to. He saw her, a small, determined figure walking away into the vast, moonlit darkness. He did not hesitate. He moved with a swift, urgent purpose, pulling on his boots and grabbing his gun belt. He was out the door and in the barn in seconds. He threw a saddle on his other horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, his movements fluid and practiced. He did not bother with a bridle, just looped a rope around the mare's jaw and swung onto her bare back. He caught up to her at the creek. the sound of his horse's hooves on the damp earth finally making her stop and turn. Her face was a pale oval in the moonlight, her expression a mixture of terror and resignation. She looked like a ghost, caught between worlds. He slid off the mare's back and stood before her, the horse's reins held loosely in his hand. The air was cold, and he could see her breath misting in the air. "Do not do this, Evelyn," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual control. "I have to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He will come for me. He will burn everything. Because of me, I will not let that happen." "This is my fight," he said, taking a step closer. "You did not ask for it, but it is mine now." "No," she said, shaking her head, tears finally beginning to stream down her cheeks. "It is my shame, my trouble. I will not lay it at your feet any longer. Please, let me go." He looked at her then, at this brave, broken girl who was willing to walk back into hell to save him. He saw the 5 years of emptiness stretching behind him and the cold, desolate future that awaited him if she left. He saw the small moments of warmth she had brought into his life, her quiet presence by the fire, the way she spoke to his horse, the ghost of a smile that had transformed her face. These were the first things he had allowed himself to feel since he had buried his family, and he realized in that stark, moonlit moment that he could not lose them. He could not go back to the silence. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a hardened protector, but the voice of a man on the verge of losing everything for a second time. It was a plea, a confession, a truth torn from the deepest, most wounded part of his soul. "If you leave," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he had long since buried, "I will lose what little is left of me." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. She had seen herself as a burden, a liability. She had never, in her wildest imaginings, thought she could be something to be missed, something to be valued. Her resolve crumbled. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish, and she crumpled, her face in her hands. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and the clean night air, and held on as if he were a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. It was not an embrace of comfort, but of mutual, desperate need. They stood there for a long time by the cold, murmuring creek, two broken people clinging to each other under the indifferent gaze of the moon. Back in the cabin, the fire was nearly out. He added a log, and the flames slowly licked back to life, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the raw, exposed emotions of the confrontation by the creek. They did not speak. They did not need to. Everything had been said. Evelyn sat on the rug by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her earlier tears replaced by a profound, exhausted stillness. Calder sat in his chair, watching her, the fortress around his heart now a field of rubble. He saw the pale, jagged line of a scar near his temple, a memento from the raiders, a physical reminder of the day his world had ended. Slowly, hesitantly, Evelyn reached out a hand. Her fingers, as light as a moth's wing, traced the line of the scar. It was an act of incredible intimacy, a touch that acknowledged his pain, his history, his brokenness. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shiver running through him. He opened his eyes and looked at her. A single, silent tear was making its way down her cheek, a glistening track in the firelight. He raised his own hand, his movement slow, and gently brushed it away. His calloused thumb traced the path of the tear, a touch that was both a comfort and a question. In that moment, the dam of pain and fear and loneliness that had held them captive for so long finally broke. He leaned forward, and she leaned in to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was a drowning man's first breath, a starving man's first taste of bread. It was the quiet, aching confession of a need so profound it had lived in darkness for years. It was the beginning of a bond deeper than either of them had dared to believe they deserved. A fragile and beautiful thing forged in the heart of their shared pain. The uneasy peace held for 4 more days. 4 days of quiet understanding, of shared glances that spoke volumes, of a new, tender awareness that hummed in the air between them. They were 4 days of stolen time, and they both knew it. The bounty hunters arrived at dawn, 3 of them, just as Calder had expected, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun as they crested the ridge. He had been awake for an hour, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, the Winchester resting across his lap. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and calm, "get in the house. Bar the door. Stay away from the window." She was at his side in an instant, her face pale but her eyes steady. She nodded, squeezed his arm, and slipped back inside. The solid thud of the bar falling into place was a reassuring sound. The riders fanned out as they approached, their intentions clear. They were not here to talk. One of them unstrapped a torch from his saddle. Tobias Quinn had given his orders. Calder did not wait for them to state their business. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, sighted on the man with the torch, and fired. The shot cracked through the quiet morning air, and the man flew backward off his horse, the torch tumbling to the ground. The world erupted in smoke and thunder. Lead tore through the air, splintering the wood of the porch railing beside Calder's head. He ducked back, firing 2 more shots from the hip, forcing the remaining 2 riders to take cover behind their horses. They were professionals, and they returned fire with a deadly accuracy. He knew he was too exposed on the porch. He had to move. "Evelyn, the back window!" he yelled. He laid down covering fire, then scrambled off the porch, rolling behind the water trough as bullets chewed up the ground where he had been a second before. He needed a better angle. He began to circle around toward the side of the cabin, keeping low. One of the men broke cover, trying to get to the barn to set it ablaze. Calder rose to one knee and fired. The man grunted, clutched his chest, and fell face first into the dirt. One left. The last man was smart. He used his dead partner's horse as a shield, moving slowly, methodically, toward the front of the cabin. Calder knew what he was planning. He meant to get close enough to throw fire, to trap them inside. Calder saw his chance. There was a small gap between the horse and a stack of firewood. It would be a difficult shot. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and was about to squeeze the trigger when he heard a muffled scream from inside the cabin. The bounty hunter had fired a wild shot through the front wall. For a fraction of a second, Calder's focus broke. He thought of Evelyn, and his blood ran cold. In that instant of distraction, the bounty hunter saw him. He dropped his own rifle and drew his pistol with lightning speed. Calder saw the muzzle flash at the same time he felt the impact, a searing, white-hot agony that ripped through his left side, just below his ribs. The force of it threw him back against the cabin wall. His vision swam, the world turning gray at the edges. But through the haze of pain, he saw the man stepping out from behind the horse, pistol raised to finish the job. With the last of his strength, Calder brought the Winchester up. He did not aim. He just pointed and fired. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and he saw the man stagger, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing to the ground. Silence. The sudden, ringing quiet after the chaos was deafening. The only sound was the coppery taste of blood in his own mouth. The cabin door was thrown open, and Evelyn rushed out, her face a mask of terror. She saw the bodies, and then she saw him, slumped against the wall, his shirt soaked in a dark, spreading stain of crimson. "Calder!" she screamed, running to him. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. He slid down the wall, leaving a bloody smear on the wood. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, not knowing what to do. He looked up at her, his vision blurring. He saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror he had seen the first day in the barn, but this time it was for him. He managed a weak, pained smile. His voice was a hoarse whisper, each word an effort. "You were worth it," he rasped, his hand finding hers. "You were always worth it." Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and the world went black. The world came back to Calder in fragments of pain and darkness. He was drowning in a fever dream, adrift in a red-tinged sea. He heard the echo of gunfire, the phantom smell of gunpowder, and a woman's scream that tore through him like a second bullet. Then there would be moments of cool, blessed relief, a damp cloth on his forehead, the bitter taste of crushed leaves on his tongue, and a voice, soft and low, whispering his name like a prayer. When he finally surfaced, the first thing he saw was Evelyn. She was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head slumped forward, her face pale and exhausted in the gray light of dawn. The room was different. The table had been moved against the wall and was covered in bowls, cloths, and bundles of dried herbs. The entire cabin smelled of willow bark and yarrow. He tried to sit up, and a bolt of pure agony shot through his side, stealing his breath and forcing a groan from his lips. Her eyes snapped open instantly. She was at his side in a moment, her hands gently pushing him back against the pillows. "Do not move," she said, her voice firm, yet edged with a desperate tenderness. "You will tear the stitches." He looked down and saw that his shirt was gone. His side was tightly bound with clean strips of bedsheet, and even through the bandages, he could feel the fiery throb of the wound. "The stitches?" he rasped, his throat as dry as dust. "I used a sewing needle and boiled thread," she said, her gaze fixed on the bandage, as if she could see through it to the damage beneath. "It was all I had. I packed the wound with yarrow to stop the bleeding, like my grandmother taught me." He stared at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the determined set of her jaw. This was not the terrified girl who had hidden in his barn. This was a woman forged in fire, her fear burned away to reveal a core of tempered steel. She had dragged his dead weight into the cabin, faced the carnage in the yard, and somehow, with nothing but folk remedies and sheer force of will, she had anchored his life when it was threatening to drift away. For days, she was his keeper. She cleaned and redressed the wound with a steady hand, her touch surprisingly clinical and sure. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever that consumed him, forcing him to drink it sip by painful sip. She made a thin broth from one of the chickens and spooned it into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. She was a constant, tireless presence, moving through the small cabin with a quiet, fierce devotion that humbled him. He would watch her through fever-hazed eyes, this small woman who had single-handedly held back the darkness. The long nights were the worst. The pain would intensify, and the ghosts would come for him. He would see Sarah's face in the flickering lamplight, hear Thomas's laughter on the wind outside. He would cry out in his sleep, and Evelyn would be there, her cool hand on his brow, her soft voice pulling him back from the precipice of memory. One night, when the fever had finally broken and his mind was clear, the silence in the room felt too heavy to bear. He was weak, his body ached, but the emptiness inside him was a different, older pain. His gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound book on the mantelpiece, its cover worn smooth with time. "The book," he said, his voice a dry whisper. Would you read to me?" Evelyn looked at the book, then back at him, her expression hesitant. She knew what it was. She had dusted it a dozen times, had seen the faded inscription on the inside cover. "To my Calder, with all my love. Sarah." It was a piece of his past, a sacred relic of the life he had lost. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. He just nodded. He needed to hear a voice in the darkness, and he wanted it to be hers. She took the book down with a reverence usually reserved for a Bible. She sat in the chair by his bed and opened it, the pages whispering as they turned. She began to read, her voice clear and low, filling the quiet cabin with words of love and loss, of changing seasons and enduring hope. The poetry was simple, the sentiments direct, but in her voice, they became a balm, a gentle melody that soothed the ragged edges of his soul. He closed his eyes, listening. He had not heard these words since Sarah had read them to him, her head resting on his shoulder as they sat on the porch of this very cabin. He had thought the sound of them would break him, but it did not. Hearing them in Evelyn's voice did not erase the memory of his wife. It honored it. It was as if one good woman was paying tribute to another, and he was the quiet beneficiary of their grace. When she finished a poem and looked up, she saw tears tracking silently from the corners of his closed eyes. She made a motion to put the book down, thinking she had hurt him. "Do not stop," he said. Without opening his eyes, he reached out a hand, and she took it, her small, cool fingers lacing with his. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "She was soft like you," he said, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "But you are braver." The words were a release. He was not comparing them. He was distinguishing them. He was acknowledging the ghost that stood between them and telling Evelyn that she was not a replacement, that her strength was her own, unique and powerful. He was telling her that he saw her. In that moment, the past and the present made a fragile, painful kind of peace, and the space between them was no longer haunted. A few days later, a visitor arrived. Evelyn was outside, drawing water from the well, when a man on a big bay gelding rode into the yard. He was a tall, powerfully built black man with a calm, steady face and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted with an easy grace and gave her a polite nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a deep, quiet baritone. "I have come to see Calder." A flicker of fear went through her, but there was an undeniable decency in the man's face. "He is resting," she said. "He was shot." The man's calm expression hardened into one of concern. "I had a feeling there was trouble." He looked past her to the fresh mounds of dirt near the barn where she had buried the bounty hunters. "Looks like the trouble found him. My name is Isaac." Calder was awake when Isaac entered the cabin. A genuine smile touched Calder's lips for the first time in a week. "Isaac, I am glad to see you." "You look like hell, my friend," Isaac said, but his eyes were warm. He pulled up a chair. "I was in Red Creek. Heard some ugly talk about you and a girl, and about Tobias Quinn. I figured I would ride out and see if you needed a second gun." Isaac had served with Calder years before, scouting for the Union Army. They were men who understood each other without needing many words. Isaac stayed for 3 days. During the day, he worked, his presence a silent, reassuring force. He helped Evelyn dispose of the bounty hunter's horses, repaired the bullet-splintered porch rail, and walked the property with a soldier's eye. Pointing out vulnerabilities, he showed Evelyn how to reload the spare pistol, his instructions clear and patient. At night, he would sit with Calder, the two men talking in low tones about the past, about the changing territory, about the nature of men like Quinn. On the third evening, as Evelyn was banking the fire for the night, she overheard Isaac's parting words to Calder. "He will not stop, you know," Isaac said, his voice grim. "A man like Quinn, his pride is all he has. You humiliated him. He cannot let that stand. He will send more men, or he will come himself. You need to be ready." The words settled in Evelyn's heart like ice. She had thought the gunfight was the end. Isaac was telling her it was only the beginning. More men would come. Calder, still weak and barely able to stand, would have to fight again. The cabin would become a fortress, their lives a constant, vigilant, waiting for death to ride over the horizon. All because of her. That night, she did not sleep. She lay on her pallet by the fire, Isaac's warning echoing in her mind. She had tried to run, but that had only brought the danger to Calder's door. Now they were waiting for the danger to return. But waiting was a form of running. It was passive. It was what she had done her whole life. Waited in a locked room. Waited for the next indignity. The next loss. Calder's words came back to her. "You are braver." Was she? Or was she just a survivor, skilled at hiding behind a stronger wall? A fierce, cold resolve began to form within her. The problem was not Calder. The problem was Quinn. And the fear that Quinn held over her was the true enemy. As long as he held that power, they would never be free. She had to take it back. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She dressed quietly, her movements deliberate. She looked at Calder, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. His face relaxed. The lines of pain eased. She would not let him die for her. She walked out to the corral, saddled the buckskin mare, and rode out, not into the wilderness, but straight toward the heart of her fear, Red Creek. The town was just waking up when she arrived. She tied the mare to the hitching post in front of the saloon, the one place she knew she would find him. She walked through the swinging doors, her head held high. The room smelled of stale beer and regret. A few bleary-eyed men looked up from their cards, their expressions turning from curiosity to scorn as they recognized her. Tobias Quinn was at the bar, drinking whiskey despite the early hour. He saw her reflection in the mirror behind the counter and turned, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Look what the cat dragged in. Come crawling back, have you? Tired of playing house with that broken-down cowboy?" Evelyn walked straight up to him, stopping a few feet away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "The bounty," she said. "Take it down." Quinn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I do not think so. You are my property, and I always collect what is mine." "I am not your property," she said, her voice rising with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I am not a thing. You will take down the bounty, and you will leave us alone." His smile vanished, replaced by a flash of rage. He was not used to being defied, especially not by her. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. He dragged her out onto the boardwalk in front of the saloon for all the town to see. "You do not tell me what to do," he hissed, his face contorted with fury. "You have forgotten your place." He drew back his hand and slapped her, hard, across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the morning quiet. Her head snapped back, and she stumbled, the boardwalk reeling beneath her feet. She tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood in her mouth. For a moment, the old, familiar terror washed over her, threatening to pull her under. She felt the eyes of the town on her, saw the smirks and the averted gazes. She was being publicly shamed, put back in her place. But then she thought of Calder, lying wounded in his bed. She thought of his words. "You are braver." She straightened up slowly, her cheek screaming with pain, and met Quinn's furious gaze with one of her own, a gaze filled not with fear, but with a cold, burning fire. She spat a small stream of blood onto the dusty boardwalk at his feet. "You have already stolen too much from me," she said, her voice low and clear, each word a declaration of war. "You do not get my fear too." A stunned silence fell over the street. Quinn stared at her, momentarily speechless at her defiance. He raised his hand to strike her again, but a voice cut through the tension, quiet and deadly. "That is far enough. Quinn." Calder was standing at the corner of the street, leaning against a porch post for support. He was pale and gaunt, and a fresh patch of red was beginning to stain the bandage visible beneath his torn shirt. But his eyes were chips of gray ice. The Winchester was in his hands. He had woken to an empty cabin and a cold fire. He had seen the buckskin mare gone, and he had known, with a sickening certainty, where she had gone and why. Isaac. who had been sleeping in the barn, had helped him saddle Jericho. The ride to town had been agony, every jolt of the horse a fresh torment to his wounded side, but he had pushed through it. He pushed himself off the post and walked slowly, deliberately, toward them, his gaze never leaving Quinn. He did not go to Evelyn's side. He simply stood in the middle of the street, a silent, lethal threat. Just then, Isaac emerged from the general store, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, and took up a position on the opposite side of the street. The townspeople, who had been watching the drama unfold, now began to stir. Silas Croft came out onto his porch. A few ranchers, men who respected Calder, moved to stand a little straighter. The invisible lines were being drawn. Quinn, seeing his public humiliation turning into a full-blown standoff, was consumed by a desperate rage. He released Evelyn, shoving her aside, and drew his pistol. "This is between you and me, Reese!" he screamed. But Calder was already moving. Before Quinn could even raise his gun, Calder closed the distance and hit him. It was not a wild swing, but a single, precise, powerful punch that snapped Quinn's head back and sent him sprawling into the dirt. His pistol skittered across the street. Calder stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a grim mask of pain and fury. He could kill him. He could raise the rifle and end it right there, and no one in this town would say a word. The raw, animal urge for vengeance, the same rage that had consumed him after his family was killed, rose in his throat. But then he looked at Evelyn, who was watching him, her eyes wide. He saw not fear of Quinn, but fear for him, for what he might become. He looked down at the pathetic, groveling man in the dust and saw not a monster, but just a man, hollowed out by greed and hate. Killing him would solve nothing. It would only plant more seeds of hate in a world already choked with them. He lowered the rifle. "You do not bury hate with more hate," he said. The words meant more for himself than for anyone else. He turned his back on Quinn and walked to Evelyn's side. The tension on the street broke. The show was over. Quinn, defeated and shamed, scrambled for his gun and slunk back into the saloon. Calder looked at Evelyn, at her bruised cheek and bleeding lip, at the incredible, defiant strength in her eyes. He reached out and gently touched her face. The moment his touch registered, the adrenaline that had been holding her up vanished. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was like a physical blow, washed over her. Her eyes rolled back, and her legs gave out. He caught her before she hit the ground, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He lifted her into his arms. She was light, a fragile weight against his chest. He turned and carried her to his horse, the townspeople watching in a stunned, shamed silence. He mounted Jericho with her in his arms and, without a backward glance, began the long, quiet ride home. The confrontation in Red Creek broke something open, not just in the town, but between them. The violence was an exorcism, purging the last of the overt threats and leaving behind a quiet, clean space for something new to grow. As autumn deepened, Calder's wound healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar on his side that mirrored the older one on his temple. They were a matched set now, both marked by the battle to protect what was theirs. Then the winter came, burying the prairie in a deep and profound silence. The first snow fell thick and heavy, a white blanket that covered the raw, new graves by the barn and the scarred earth of the yard. It muffled the world, softened the sharp edges, and insulated their small cabin from everything but each other. The land, which had been a stage for violence and fear, was now a canvas of pristine, untouched peace. The past year, with all its fury and pain, was laid to rest under a shroud of white. They lived quietly, their days falling into a simple, domestic rhythm dictated by the needs of the animals and the demands of the cold. They were closer now than ever, their bond forged not in soft words or grand declarations, but in the shared crucible of survival. Closeness was in the way she knew just how he liked his coffee, strong and black, It was in the way he would place an extra log on the fire when he saw her shiver, without a word being spoken. It was in the long, comfortable silences they shared in the evenings. She mending his worn clothes by the firelight, he cleaning a piece of tack, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind outside. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin with an unconscious grace, two solitary planets that had found a shared, steady orbit. As the weeks of deep winter passed, Evelyn began to change. The watchful, haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet confidence. The world within the cabin was safe, but she began to feel the pull of the world outside it, not as a place of threat, but as a place where she might now have a footing. When the snows finally began to thaw, she made a decision. She rode into Red Creek, not with defiance, but with a quiet purpose. She went to the general store, where Silas Croft's wife, Eleanor, a woman with kind eyes and a weary face, was struggling to read a letter from her sister back east. Eleanor's eyesight was failing, and she held the page at arm's length, squinting. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Evelyn asked softly. Eleanor looked up, startled, then suspicious. The town had not forgotten the standoff, but Calder's words at the town hall had planted a seed of doubt in the soil of their judgment. They had watched Quinn slink out of town a week after the confrontation, his reputation in tatters, and a grudging respect for the cowboy and the girl he protected had begun to grow. "I suppose I would," Eleanor said, her tone cautious. Evelyn read the letter, her voice clear and steady. When she was finished, Eleanor Croft looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, she saw not the fallen woman of the preacher's sermons, but a smart, gentle young woman who had offered a simple kindness. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and the words were genuine. "Many of us around here, we never had the chance to learn our letters properly. An idea took root. Evelyn started small. She offered to teach Eleanor to read. Soon, another rancher's wife, tired of having to ask her husband to read the labels on tins, shyly joined them. They would meet in a corner of the general store, their heads bent together over a tattered primer. Evelyn also knew how to stitch with a fineness and precision that was a marvel. It was one of the useless, decorative skills she had been taught in that locked room. But she now repurposed it, teaching the women how to mend their families' clothes with neat, invisible seams, how to turn a scrap of fabric into something beautiful. She earned a cautious respect. It was not full acceptance. Preacher Gable and his wife still looked through her as if she were made of glass, and some of the more pious women would cross the street to avoid her. But others, the more practical, less judgmental ones, began to nod when she passed. They would ask her opinion on a pattern, or ask her to help them decipher a recipe. She was no longer just Calder Reese's charity case. She was becoming Evelyn, a woman with skills and a quiet dignity that could not be denied. She was finding her voice, not by shouting, but by teaching others to find theirs. One night, as a late winter storm raged outside, Calder was watching her as she read by the fire, her face softened and illuminated by the flickering light. He had healed on the outside, but he knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a terror, that she had healed something deeper inside him. The hollow, aching silence he had lived with for 5 years was gone, filled by her quiet, steady presence. "I never thought I would love again," he confessed, the words emerging from a place of deep, guarded vulnerability. "After Sarah and Thomas, I thought that part of me was buried with them." Evelyn looked up from her book, her pale blue eyes holding his. She considered his words, her expression serious and thoughtful. She did not offer him platitudes or easy reassurances. She offered him a truth that was as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. "You did not," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You just never stopped loving, right?" He stared at her, the simple power of her words washing over him. She was right. He had not started loving again. He had simply found someone else worthy of the love that had been there all along. The love that made him stand for the sodbusters, that made him protect her, that made him face down a town. It was not a new feeling, but an old one, finally given a new home. He had never stopped being the man who loved fiercely and protectively. He had just stopped having someone to give that love to. The conversation opened a new door between them, a door to a future he had never dared to imagine. A week later, he found her by the creek, standing under the bare branches of the cottonwood tree. It was the first truly warm day, and the air held the promise of spring. She was looking at the two simple wooden crosses that marked the graves. "This was their home," she said quietly, not looking at him. "This was their life. I feel like a ghost here sometimes, like I'm living in a house that belongs to someone else." The old shame, the feeling of unworthiness, was a deep and stubborn root. "This is your house now," he said. "Our house." "But I am not like her," she whispered, the words laced with a pain he understood all too well. "What they did to me, it made me unclean. I am not fit to stand in her place. I am not fit for marriage, for a proper life." It was the first and only time they ever argued. His voice was sharp, not with anger at her, but at the men who had branded her with this undeserved shame. "Do not ever say that," he said, turning her to face him. "Do not let them win. Do not let their filth be the thing you measure yourself by." "But it is the truth," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "The town, the preacher, they see what I am, a fallen woman. I cannot be your wife. Calder, I would bring you nothing but dishonor." He gripped her arms, his gaze intense. There was no ceremony in his words, no poetry. There was only a raw, desperate honesty. He did not get down on one knee. He simply stood before her, under the tree where his past was buried, and offered her a future. "I am not asking you to forget what they did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am asking you to remember who we are now." She looked at him, at the fierce sincerity in his eyes, at the man who had seen the absolute worst of her, the worst of the world, and had not flinched. He was not offering to erase her past. He was offering to build a future with her, scars and all. Her tears fell freely then, but they were tears of release, of a final, shuddering surrender to the possibility of happiness. She nodded, unable to speak, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as the first buds of spring promised a new beginning all around them. They were wed a month later, when the cottonwood tree was covered in a canopy of fresh, green leaves. The day was bright and clear, the prairie alive with wildflowers. They stood by the creek, on the very spot where she had wept and he had proposed. There was no preacher. They did not need one. Their vows had already been made, in gunfights and quiet confessions, in shared silences and desperate embraces. Only 3 people attended. Isaac, who had ridden 100 miles to be there, stood as Calder's witness, his calm, steady presence a blessing in itself, and Eleanor and Silas Croft, who had defied the town's lingering judgment to stand with them, brought a loaf of freshly baked bread as a wedding gift. Evelyn wore a simple dress of pale blue calico that Eleanor had helped her sew. There were wildflowers tucked into her dark hair. She did not look like a blushing bride from a storybook. She looked better. She glowed with a quiet, hard-won dignity. As Calder took her hand, he saw not a victim, not a survivor, but his partner, his equal, a woman of incredible, unbreakable strength. They spoke their simple promises to each other, their words carried away by the gentle spring breeze. And as he kissed her, he felt the last of the winter chill finally leave his soul. The seasons turned. The rhythm of their life was quiet, steady, and good. The ranch prospered, and they healed. One evening, the following winter, the first snow of the season began to fall, the flakes drifting down in the twilight like soft, white feathers. A deep peace had settled over the land once more. Evelyn sat by the fire, the warm light playing on her face. She was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a familiar, practiced grace. The hole was near the cuff, a simple tear from a day of hard work. Calder came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots. He was dusty and tired, smelling of horse and cold air. The lines of pain and sorrow that had once been carved so deeply into his face had softened, smoothed by a year of peace and quiet love. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her work. He leaned down and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her temple. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. But the ghosts of the past, though quiet, never truly disappear. They only learn to whisper. She thought of all the pain that had led them to this moment, of the fragility of happiness in a world that could be so cruel. She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes searching his. She asked the question that had defined their beginning, the question that was the title of their story. But this time, it held a different meaning. It was not a question of fear, but of love. It was the question of every heart that has ever dared to open itself completely to another. She whispered, "Will it hurt again?" He knelt beside her chair, taking the shirt from her hands and setting it aside. He took her hands in his calloused thumbs stroking her skin. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a love so deep and certain it was the most solid thing in the world. He held her close, his answer a quiet, solemn promise against the backdrop of the crackling fire and the gently falling snow. "Only if you ever doubt I love you." They had survived the worst the world could throw at them. They had faced down shame, hatred, and violence. And through it all, they had chosen each other. Not in spite of their broken pieces, but because of them. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.